Psalms, Old Testament. It's almost Christmas, and here we are in Psalm 90, and you should be thinking, what the heck? This is going to be one of those Sundays. This is going to be one of those Sundays where we actually go someplace a little bit unexpected. Marilyn?
Yes, dear.
Thank you. Where we actually go someplace a little bit unexpected, because this is where I feel like God has been speaking to me this week. I thought we were actually going to kind of work through the passages that we just read, and there's a reason why we just read them. I'll come to that in just a second. But Psalm 90 really spoke to me, and I feel like that's where we should spend some time. So today's going to be interactive. It's going to feel kind of like a workshop, and it's going to be very practical. How do you actually read? And I just want to start with two thoughts, and these are the important thoughts, so I hope you hear this. Okay? Here's the first thought. It's really a question. In the midst of dark times, think of the darkness in your life. How do you actually rehearse the gospel and preach it to yourself? In other words, how do you connect what you are reading? For instance, we just have been reading the Christmas story. So you read about Zechariah and Elizabeth. It's a lifetime devoted to God. They've lived blameless, but God still hasn't given them the one thing they most want, which is a child. Do you feel the darkness of that? If you had lived your entire life and done everything right, and yet God still has kind of withheld this thing that you really, really desire, and it's a good thing to have a child.
Well, Elizabeth even says it talks about removing her reproach.
Yep. She feels reproach. Okay. Mary and Joseph, a lifetime ahead of them, not behind them, but up until this point, they might have looked like a perfect couple. And the angel shows up and says, congrats, you're going to have a kid, which is the one thing they don't want, not yet, not before they're married. They haven't done anything wrong, but that's how everybody's going to view them. Do you feel the darkness of that? We didn't read this passage, but it's in Luke chapter 2. There's a guy named Simeon, a really old guy in the temple who's been waiting his entire life for God to act, to redeem Israel, to send his Messiah. And God says, hey, it's going to happen and you're going to see it before you die. But instead of uniting Israel, he says it's actually going to be a source of Israel's greatest division. Think about this. Jesus is the most divisive figure in the history of Israel, period. It split Judaism right down the middle and ended up forming a completely new world faith. And the angel tells, or Zechariah says prophetically, he is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel. A sword is going to pierce your soul also. In other words, do you feel the darkness of that? When God is going to do something, but it's actually going to split your church or split your community or split your people, and you're going to have folks who land on both sides. How do you be friends? It's going to split family. Okay, so you're reading those things. There's actually darkness in the passage, and the question is, how do you connect their darkness, the things that you're reading about, to the gospel, hope, okay, and to your darkness, where you're living now? In other words, let me rephrase the question. In the midst of dark times, how do you rehearse the gospel, preach it to yourself, connecting from what you're reading to the good news to where you're living? How do you do that for you and for your kids and for others? That is a really important question. That is one of the most important things as a parent you need to figure out. How do you help your kids actually connect from this world's darkness and the darkness in scriptures to hope? Okay, second thing. This is more of an observation. The second thing is about the importance of reading, learning, and teaching. And I'm going to start with teaching. We live in a day and age spiritually where even people who identify as Christians are often very ambivalent about the importance or value of teaching. You see it in mainstream churches. You also see it in house churches. I know a lot of people who think teaching is nice, but it's not particularly important. Like if you don't have it, no big deal. Okay? It's not a priority. And I think that the only way that that happens is either you've never experienced good teaching to understand how valuable it is, or you actually don't feel value or appreciate the need for learning. See what I'm saying? If you don't think you need to learn something, you don't think you need to be taught. Okay? Now let me say something about learning. So teaching, learning. Amos 8:11, Old Testament prophet, towards the end of the Old Testament, makes this statement: the days are coming, says the Lord, when I'm going to send a famine on the land. Not a famine of bread, not a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. Have you guys heard that passage before? He actually says one of the marks of the world and of my own people is they're not going to be hearing. All right? And I think the point here is, until you become really hungry, really thirsty, really famished for learning about God, you're probably not going to fully appreciate your need to be taught, even if you do have great teaching. And all of those things, those two things, your view on teaching and your view on learning, are going to impact your view on reading. If reading feels dry, dusty, or optional to you, it's probably because you haven't become a rabid learner yet. And if you're not a rabid learner, you probably don't realize how much you need to be taught. And that's why darkness in this life, darkness in your life, don't touch, is actually a gift to wake you up and make you uncomfortable and actually get you to start seeking a different way. So what I'd like to do this morning is just an exercise in reading. We are going to read Psalm 90 together. Okay? So we're going to do 3 readings of it. The first reading, this kind of follows the universal outline. First reading, what's the story? We're just going to read it, but slowly. Second reading, I'm going to give you my reading. I'm going to read through it again, but I'm going to just say things. I'm going to share things that I see. Third reading, where are you in the story? We're going to give you a chance to respond to it. Okay? Does that make sense? So in other words, this is really kind of a meditative exercise. You need a Bible, okay, in order to do this. It will be extremely helpful. So if you don't have one, grab one. Jordan, somebody can pass them around. Okay. Let's start with reading number 1. Jordan, would you be willing to read it? Yep. Now here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to tell you. I want everybody to follow along. And I'm going to say pause. I'm going to force you to pause in places. Just so everybody can think about what you're saying. So kind of slow, steady, and I'm going to be like, pause. Go. All right. You ready? Yep. Psalm 90. Go for it.
A prayer of Moses, a man of God. That's an important part of it. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations.
Pause. Go.
Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God.
Pause. Go ahead.
You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night.
Pause.
You'd sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed, and in the evening it fades and withers.
Pause. Go ahead.
For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence.
Pause. Okay.
For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you?
Pause. Go for it.
So teach us to number our days, that we might get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have a pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we might rejoice and be glad in all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands.
The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, I have a question. How many of you guys open up the Psalms to read them, and you like read through the whole thing, and you're like, I have no idea what I just read? Does that happen to anybody? Happens to me all the time. Okay, now listen. The very first thing that I want you to see is how many of you, just by pausing and like looking at a page, actually you're like, oh, I got a little bit more out of it. I stayed a little bit more engaged. Okay, so the very first thing that I want to encourage you with is just to recognize how you need to be more deliberate in your reading. A lot of us who struggle with reading, and I know you guys struggle with reading. Okay, you know what? We think it's either not a big deal or the problem is the stuff I'm reading is just boring. And actually, the problem is, first and foremost, us. We are ADD when it comes to God. Attention deficit disorder. And so just doing this like deliberate, like, oh, I'm going to try to slow down. And as soon as you catch yourself going on autopilot, you're like, wait a second, I don't know what I just read. Start over. What you will find is just reading through this one time, like kind of slowly and steadily, working your way through it, doing pauses, you're actually going to see, you will find your level of attention and what you're getting something out of it goes way up. So now let me ask a question. What's this psalm about in kind of like one or two sentences? Based on what you just heard.
Our life juxtaposed to the presence of God.
Okay, our life juxtaposed to the presence of God.
Flimsiness of our life juxtaposed to God's. When it's in God's presence and power, it's nothing.
Okay, the flimsiness of our life juxtaposed with God's. Now you said presence and power, but somebody else said like eternity. So okay, that's a really good sentence. Anybody else want to take a stab? Jen Frieden, what do you have? I know you always have smart things.
That our life is limited, and if you wait to get God involved in your life, you're going to get to the end of your days and be like, shit, I messed
Yep.
this up.
Our life is really limited. Don't wait until the very end and realize how much you miss. Okay, that's great. Anybody else? There's not like a right or wrong answer here. I mean, there probably is a wrong answer. If you're like, this is about baseball, it's like, no, this is not about baseball.
I got something a little different.
Yeah.
I was right. So it starts out talking about. I don't know how to sum it. I'm not very good at summarizing things, but it talks about how God's our dwelling place, right? So if we want to be within God, that actually like His wrath and His anger is a part of that, and it's like a part of purification, right? And then the last thing I got right is then, but with that wrath follows love, right? And follows.
Okay, you're already, Chelsea, this is great. You are already starting to go into that second reading. In other words, what you did there is you didn't change anything that's been previously said, but you piggybacked. There's an additional you're like, hey, wait, there's something about anger in here, but there's also something about love. Okay? What you're starting to do, as soon as you do that, you're starting to know some of the themes and the threads, and you're starting to think about, like, how do I synthesize this and put it together? So just asking yourself the question, what is this thing about, is a really helpful question. Okay. Now what I'm going to, everybody kind of, do you feel like you're a little bit more engaged in the psalm now? Now we're going to do reading 2, okay, which is kind of, where's the gospel in this? That's what we're going towards. And what I'm going to do is I am going to give you kind of my notes and observations just as I read through. So Chelsea, this would be a place where, for those of you who don't take notes or don't journal, I would highly recommend. Yeah. Antonio, you get a pass still because you can't even read yet, so I don't expect you to journal. Okay. Yet, but it's coming. Okay. Temporary pass. Listen, one of the things that you will find incredibly helpful is as soon as you notice something interesting, like what you just noticed, Chelsea, write it down.
Anger, that's weird.
It's amazing, okay? Writing something down. First of all, have you guys ever met people and you struggle to remember their names? Yeah, okay, listen, I'm terrible with names. So I have worked really hard over the years. The first thing I can do is if I can say, wait a second, let me really focus. It's Mary Beth. And then I'm like, do I know anybody else named Mary Beth? I don't. Okay, I do know somebody named Sarah Beth, so I try to make connections. But if I can go and write that name down with, in parentheses, where did I meet him or who introduced me to him? Okay, guess what your retention does? Way up. Like significantly up. So what you're trying to do is not to write profound things. You're just trying to write things that you see. And you're trying to be as brief and as quick as you can. Just like, this is interesting. There's something about anger in here, but then it goes on to love. And normally we think anger is like the opposite of love. But the psalmist doesn't say, and so you're just like making notes. And as you're reading through it, you're going to start reading through it again. And each time you read through, you're kind of just following those lines and going, what stands out to me as interesting? Which you guys already know how to do because we did that. Think about this. As we were reading through the Luke passage, what were you guys doing? You were spotting stuff that you think is interesting. And what happens is, when other people see things, it spurs another thought. So what I'm getting at is part of the reason that we struggle with reading is most of us don't approach reading this way. We just like read it and we're like, I didn't even catch it, and we close our Bibles. Okay, so let me go through reading number 2. I'm going to give you my reading, things that stand out to me, and I want to encourage you to follow, just like follow along as I read this. Okay. So, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Do you see how that's like a title? Listen, there's something very interesting. This is the first thing I noticed. Did you know that this is the only psalm in the Bible attributed to Moses?
Really?
In the Psalter, yeah. I'm not sure if there's another one someplace else. There might be. Okay. Do you know how I figured that out?
You chat GPT?
No, I didn't use ChatGPT. I used my little Blue Letter Bible app, and I searched for the name Moses. And then I scrolled all the way down to the Psalms, and I saw every reference to Moses, and there's only one where it's in the heading, attributed to Moses. In other words, you can do that. Get a little Bible app.
Or use ChatGPT.
Or
And when you-
ChatGPT?
Yeah.
No, I'm telling you, it's great.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay. That is not in my sermon notes. Jerry's still out in my book on that. I'm like, just grab a Bible app, like Blue Letter Bible.
Large way.
Okay, listen.
You gotta teach the artificial intelligence though.
Yeah, we have some.
So, listen. Who is Moses? Let's think about that for a second. Moses is the guy the really, really big guy in the Old Testament story that went up on the mountain, got the law, the 10 Commandments, and he talked face to face with God. Now, you know what's interesting? For somebody who is like everywhere in the Old Testament associated as the giver of the law, there is nothing in this psalm about rules, commandments, laws. Do you know what this psalm is about? Wisdom. That's interesting. I actually think that what Moses is doing here is he is meditating on the passing of time and how that locates us in the world, which is actually what the Christmas story does as well.
Wait, you said it's about the passage of time? Say it again?
Listen, I think this psalm is a meditation on the passing of time, the fleetingness. In other words, you don't think the things that he's talking about in this psalm, we'll get there in a second. A man lives 70 years, 80 if he's strong. Okay? It's like Ecclesiastes. In other words, that's somebody who's at the tail end of their life actually starting to think, this is your language, Jen, about like, hey, what is the meaning and like, what is this really all about? Mary Beth.
Well, like putting it in the context of Moses, I feel like this just popped in my head. This is probably after God has said, this generation's not going to the promised land, and you, Moses, are not going to the promised land. Because that makes a lot more sense in this, like, we are loved, but you are angry, and we have to deal with it. Like,
Yep.
you're being punished.
Okay, that would be a great detail. So if you're taking notes, you're like, oh, this is interesting. Write that down. Absolutely. Malachi.
Yeah, so I'm going to tie in something. I've been listening to Glenn Kaiser's Gospel Blues lately.
Yep.
And I heard this line yesterday. It talks about, I can't remember I won't be able to say it, I'm going to paraphrase it. He's like, all of your moments are precious to God. Right? So like, we're wasting all of these moments that are precious to God. So when he says that, like, number our days, right? Moses is like, we don't have it, but God thinks they're precious. So like, what are you doing with your days?
What are you doing with your days?
What are you doing with your days? Like, somebody's like, teach us to number our days. There's like, everything around this is the context of numbering your days.
Yep.
It's
Okay.
dwelling in God's.
So now hold that thought. You're already jumping ahead, which is great. No, this is good. Okay, you're making connections. What we're getting at is just the thought of numbering your days. You're actually stepping back and going, what do my days amount to? And what I'm suggesting to you is that's actually how we should be approaching the Christmas story. Okay? It's what I was doing back there where I said, hey, Zachariah and Elizabeth, think about the darkness that they've experienced. Mary and Joseph, think about the darkness that they've experienced. Zachariah, think about the darkness that he's experienced. These guys aren't reading the Christmas story nostalgically, like, oh, it was so great, and, you know, thinking of that. They're thinking about darkness, and somehow God has penetrated that. And I think what Moses is doing in this psalm is this meditation on the darkness of life, to Mary Beth's point. These great promises, but they don't seem to get realized the way we hoped. Okay? Look at verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place. It is really interesting to me that when he talks about dwelling place, I would expect him to say promised land, because everything in Moses' journey is like, I'm going to take you out of Egypt into the promised land. So you would think that he would be like, the promised land is our dwelling place. And instead, he says God is our real promised land, which again would make an awful lot of sense if he's just been told that he's not going to get to go into the promised land.
Well, he also
Okay.
says you, the person, referring to a person and not a place.
Lord, you have been our dwelling place. Now, this is something else.
Didn't they spend the last 40 years like living with?
They spent a lot of time in the desert.
But they have the
They've got the,
fire at night,
Yep.
cloud by day, right? So like, he's physically there.
yeah,
Moses has spent the last 50 years or whatever after leaving Egypt with the literal presence of God, like in a tangible form. And then he's the one who's going up on the mountain, like God's coming, he's in the tabernacle. So like, it's not a metaphor. God is literally their dwelling place. Wherever they're at, God's there.
There's a line in a Rich Mullins song that says, I could be at home, something to the effect of, I'm at home any place if you are where I am. And I think what Moses is putting, this is what's so unusual, guys. Moses is actually looking at a deity, a divinity, and he's saying, that is a person, you. I can know him. He's my dwelling place. As I have studied ancient Near Eastern history, I don't know of any other ancient culture that said this kind of thing. For them, deities were always localized to geography. You see what I'm saying? In other words, the deity dwells in a place. And Moses is turning this around and saying, no, our places actually dwell in you. And he sees this across all generations. He's actually looking back. He's not just looking at like, oh, from this time forward. I think he's looking at all of humanity here. Look at verse 2. Before the mountains were brought forth, or you had ever formed the earth and the world from everlasting to everlasting. Again, what's he doing? I think he's looking around him at creation. He's recognizing this place is far older than we are. And he says, you, God, are far older than it is. See what I'm saying? It's hard. We don't have mountains here. In Montana, you have mountains. Okay, but if you go out to Big Bend, you see, and you're like, dude, this is old. And you start to realize how small we are. Think about this. We know so much more now in the 21st century about the earth, about our planet, about our history. We know that it wasn't just thousands of years or millions of years. It's been billions of years. Okay, unless you're a new earth, young earth, whatever, and that's fine. Okay. Everything that we're seeing tells us the world is very, very old and the universe is very, very big. And there's not just thousands of stars out there. Okay? There's billions of stars, and there's actually billions of galaxies with billions of stars. You see what I'm saying? And all of that, he's doing the same thing. He's looking at the mountains. He's looking at creation. And he's going, that is so much longer and more permanent than we are. We come and go, come and go, come and go. People have been coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. And we have these same mountains, these same hills that barely changed. And he's going, those things are nothing compared to God. Do you see what he's doing? Kind of that stair step? And what that does is it makes you feel small. It puts you in perspective, but it also makes you feel close. Think of it this way. 4,000 years ago, that's actually a blip if this universe is billions of years old, which means you and Moses have an awful lot in common. You have more in common than you do different. Yeah, our cult, we've got cell phones. He wouldn't have understood that, okay? But listen, in terms of human problems, the stuff the ancient Israelites struggled with, exact same things we struggle with. Look at verse 3. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. Okay? It's interesting here. This is not a dust in the wind. All we are is dust in the wind. Dude, this is not that. Because that's just kind of like, it just happens. He's saying God actually speaks to death and speaks to man. He's like, return to death. In other words, God is in charge of our unbodying. God is over death in this. That makes sense? It's not like death is outside of God's control. God is actually in control of that. Death is a great equalizer. He's returning our bodies to where they began. Verse 4, 1,000 years in your sight. It's interesting to me. It seems like the ancients still thought about history much like we do in terms of millennia. It is really hard to wrap your mind around more than a couple thousand years. Like when you try to actually envision what that's like, that's probably the same thing they were wrestling with. Okay?
For them. 2,000 years before was like so ancient.
Yeah, but it's just as ancient for, like, what I'm getting at is they were still thinking,
We think about them the same way.
we think about them the exact same way they thought probably about Noah and some of the early forefathers. In other words, that it was like thousands of years. Okay. Listen, if 1,000 years is like yesterday to God, a watch in the night, then 10,000 years is just a little over a week for God. Not very long.
Isn't that like how long humans in our current form
Yeah.
have been around?
Yeah, since the end of the Ice Age. Humanity, that's when there's been a major leap forward cognitively, culturally, the explosion of culture. Okay, listen, this is verse 5. Our lives, all our hopes and dreams and fears and struggles, they seem so big to us on the front end looking ahead. But when we put them in context, they are incredibly brief, they are incredibly small, they are incredibly fleeting. And he does something interesting here. This is in verse 5 and 6. He starts with flood imagery, which sounds like natural disaster, but then in the same sentence, he tweaks it and he's like, the flood, this natural disaster is just like a dream. And dream is a much more neutral, you might have good dreams, bad dreams, but it's kind of a dream. It comes and goes. You wake up. And he's actually saying the most tremendous natural disasters that we see and experience, which are cataclysmic for us, are actually kind of like dreams in the big picture of things. And then he jumps down to an even more radical image, which is like grass in an arid climate. What happens in a desert climate, by the afternoon, the grass is all withery. And you get up the next morning when there's been cool and dew, and the grass is perked back up. And it's like, he's saying the human life is like grass. Perky in the morning, by the end of the day it withers, and then there's another human life. He's like, holy cow, we are brief. We are fleeting. What Moses is doing is he's taking his life, all his ups, all his downs, all his highs, all his lows, and he's rooting them not in his experience of the highs and lows, he's rooting them in God's story. Do you see what I'm saying there? He's actually rooting it in the big picture story. He's saying, my little life, even though it's like grass, ebbs and flows, comes and goes, it's like a dream, it's like it fades, it's fleeting, but it's part of a big story. Part of something bigger. And that actually makes Moses much smaller. Look at verse 7 and 8. We are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you. He adds another element here. So in addition to the fleeting, this is where you went, Chelsea, he adds anger, wrath, and the concept of sin. We tend to see anger as a deficiency in God. We kind of expect God to be kind, gentle, understanding, and accommodating to pretty much everything we want. And you know what's really interesting? The psalmist seems to see it more like heat, like desert, kind of like the sun. Like if you put something outside in the sun for 5 years, 10 years, you know what happens? It gets fried. If it's wood, it chips, cracks, like it destroys wood. Sun destroys wood. It weathers it. You put a piece of plastic, it does the same thing. Leave your car out in the sun for 10 years. It's going to destroy the paint. Listen, the sun is not angry at the paint on your car. The sun is UV radiation that like powers our solar system. And it's just that all of the things are so fleeting, so fragile, so frail, we can't like stand up to the heat. And that's actually kind of his view of what God is like. He is so much above us, so much beyond us, so much better than us, that we kind of get baked in like the UV radiation. And the problem is not just like paint is not sinful. We're actually sinful. And we've got this rebellious nature that's self-focused, and it actually makes God our enemy. We make God our enemy by virtue of our sin. And that really allows us, it's like it removes all our covering, and we're out there in the sun, in the desert, kind of baking. And he's like, it bakes us away. Now, listen. What's very, very interesting is that's actually our experience of life. Even if you don't believe in God, you're like, what does life do? It's actually hard. You got all these hopes and dreams and things that you like imagine are going to come true, and the reality that we experience is always worse. It never measures up to what we hope for. How many of you can relate to that? That's the heat. You see what I'm saying? Like our hopes and our dreams are getting baked by life. So why should it surprise us if God is somewhat similar to, like in other words, do you see what I'm getting at?
And if we didn't have heat, we'd die.
Yeah, if we didn't have heat, we'd die.
Just like the flood.
If we didn't have floods.
If we didn't
Yeah.
have water, we'd die, but too much water.
Yeah. Okay.
Wait, you said baked by life, but you also are saying, like, I'm not understanding your differentiation between, like, heat, maybe this is a lunch topic, heat of, like God's anger being heat versus heat of life.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is life is actually like heat. As you live your life, what you're going to find is that life is really hard. Oh, baby, it's a wild world. Hard to get by just upon a smile, girl. You know, Cat Stevens song? What's he saying there? He's going, hey, listen, you're young and you think everything's going to be great. And he's like, life's actually hard. And what I'm getting at is the hardness of life is similar to how he's describing the heat of God's anger.
So you're not saying they're one and the same.
No, I'm just saying that they're similar.
Okay.
What I'm saying is we expect God to just be all nice and cuddly. Why don't we expect life to be, like we kind of hope that life is going to be amazing, but our experience of life is a hardness. So maybe it shouldn't surprise us if our experience of God, that idea that there might be some heat, there might be some anger, and that it might have to do with our sin and our bad decisions. Okay? Now listen, I'm not saying I'm right or wrong on this. I'm just trying to meditate on what the text is saying. Okay, look at verses 9 through 11. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, 80 if you're lucky. Span is but toil and trouble. How many of you guys can just relate to that? Does life already feel like a sigh? Does it? Yeah, listen. Wait till you're my age. We're getting to the point, I have to tell you, at 55, I feel this way. I'd love to know how you guys feel. I feel this way more now at 55. How life feels like a sigh than I did at 45. Okay? The feeling accelerates as you get older. You start asking yourself what really matters or what should. You start asking yourself, what am I going to leave behind? What's my legacy? A lot of the things that you want to do or accomplish, you realize isn't going to happen. Things that I felt were important at 45, things that I thought were really important at 35, things that I thought were really, really, really important at 25, now I'm like, not so much. Life is hard. Okay? Anyone who says otherwise is selling something. I think what he is saying is that the heat, the hardness, is actually a gift from God, burning away the fog of our flesh, our delusions of grandeur. Okay, now listen, that's what's going on. Like, what he's getting at is it's everything you said, Malachi. It's what you guys said early on. We are really fleeting. God is really big and really long-lasting. There is a problem of sin, and that actually puts us into a relationship with God where his presence feels like desert sun to us sometimes. And what Moses is saying is maybe that's actually not a curse, but a gift to help burn away some of the things that don't matter. Now I'm going to jump through the last couple of verses real quick. This is like 12 through 17. everything up till now, you said it earlier, Garrett, sounds a lot like Ecclesiastes. All right? Do you remember what Ecclesiastes says over and over? Vanity. Vanity. All is vanity. You know what's really fascinating? Moses doesn't go there. This is actually not a pessimistic or bleak or negative psalm. In other words, he set all this stuff up, and then he says this, and this is where it actually starts turning into petition. This is the prayer portion of the psalm. Let me just run through this. There's 6 things. Number 1, teach us to number our days, O Lord. Do you hear the teaching language that I mentioned at the very beginning? We need to be taught. Moses is like, I need to learn. Okay? What does he want most from God? Wisdom. What do you want most from God? Okay? Second thing, return, O Lord. He's actually saying, draw near. Have pity on us, compassion. Listen, how many of our prayers are not like draw near, have mercy, compassion, but rather change my situation? Okay? Give me what I want. 3, satisfy us with your steadfast love. Moses actually seems to be saying that the thing, let me say it this way. Moses is saying there's something that never wears out. And it's God's steadfast love. He's like, that's the only thing that will satisfy me. I need that. I need your steadfast love. Yes, there's heat because I'm a sinner, but there's also this massive love and forness. You're for me. What are you asking God to satisfy you with? More money? Better job? A partner? Success? Moses is like, all those things are fleeting. 4, make us glad as many days as afflicted. Listen, if our entire life is a sigh, think about this for a second. Do you see what he's just said here? He says, make us glad for as many days as we're afflicted. How many days are they afflicted?
40 years.
What'd you say?
40 years.
No. How many days in this psalm does it sound? Your entire life you're afflicted. Now, how, if your entire life you're afflicted, can he have any hope that God's going to give him at least as many days of not affliction? He's got to believe in something past this life. You see what I'm saying? That's really interesting. Teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. Make us glad for as many days as you've afflicted us. The last 2 things, I'm just going to say this. He says, show us your work. Do you know where you see the work of God most clearly? Jesus. Okay? But also in his people. Israel, and then the church. Okay? And in your life as you become a different kind of person. All right? But he's saying, I need to see your working. I need to see your work in history. I need to see your work in your people. I need to see your work in this world that seems out of control. I need to see your work in me, becoming a different kind of person, because I don't have the power to do it myself. Follow what I'm saying? Okay? Remember how in the Old Testament, God says, I'm going to pour out my Spirit upon you. Make you an entirely new kind of people that loves me with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Those kinds of things. He's saying, we need to see your work. And then what he does after it, he says, give us favor. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us. Establish the work of our hands. What's fascinating to me about this is he doesn't say, if all of this is fleeting, our work doesn't matter. He actually goes, no, it does. But our work will only matter when we see it and we locate it in the context of God's work. And if that work remains your work and your thing, you're actually going to miss it. It's going to be fleeting. But if you can locate your work in his work, you're actually going to be able to endure both the success but also the failures that go with it. And it's not going to destroy you. And you're actually going to have something that lasts. All right. That was, okay, That was a long reading, right? Here's what I want you to think about. We'll talk about it over lunch. This is the third part. Do you feel like you have a better feel for the text? This is what I do in my journal in the morning. I'm just like writing stuff and I'm thinking. You could do this, and I want you to do this with the stories we read in Luke. Just doing the same kind of meditation. I think we might come back and talk about those next week. We'll see. Here's the third question. Third reading. So first reading, you read it. Little pauses. Second reading, you read through and you're just observing and you're thinking and you're drawing implications. The third reading is like, okay, what's the story? Where's the gospel and story? Where are you in the story? So what I'd love to hear over lunch is just share like, hey, what's your heart response to this? Okay? Wide open. Let's go to the Lord's Supper, and this will be like a really low-key kind of discussion during lunch, and then we can hang out and enjoy one another. Okay? Let me pray for us.